Let's talk about the top 5 wide receivers in this year's class, and anyone who says different is wrong, and they're so wrong they should, retire for all their wrongness. Thought we'd do it a little differently today, came up with a new setup, let me know what you think of it. So, top of this wide receiver class is good. The state of our class is great. I'm hearing a lot of negative things, and people should go away and shut up, because frankly, if you don't like the top wide receivers in this year's class, I don't think you're looking at it right. JSN or Jackson Smith Ninjigba is number 1 in my ranks, and it's not going to change. There's actually 2 players in my first tier for this year's class, which wasn't true last year because of the difficulties and the goodness, but not greatness, of the 2022 class. Now, as it worked out, the 2022 class had a lot of greatness for fantasy, but in terms of profiles going into the NFL, in this year's draft, there are 2 prospects that stand out above the rest. The first is JSN, and we only really have 1 year to go on, which sucks, but honestly, the year's so good, I don't care. Now, he had 32% of his team's overall receiving yards and 19% of his team's touchdowns. Now, his target share is actually a little low compared to most prospects who go on to succeed, only at 22%, but he was running 88% in the slot route with both Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave on the field, so that target share is somewhat understandable. In fact, it's very understandable, and it's also noticeable that those 2 prospects that we now love in the NFL both said he's better, so maybe we should listen to that. He also had 28% targets per route run, which is phenomenal on a team with that level of wide receiver around you. It is exaggerated because of that lower target share, but again, it's because it was a highly competitive depth chart. And again, both players chose to leave rather than continue to compete with JSN. So, yeah. Now, that slower slot rate does put him into a certain bucket, which I think brings up a lot of the dislike of this class. It's not Jamar Chase like that high low slot player, and it doesn't matter. Comps suck, and I don't do a lot of comps, and I don't have a lot of confidence in my comps because I'm not describing how players play, which is usually where comps come from. But if you want to know who I compare him to statistically in terms of this one sample size, Jamar Chase, the excellence of JSN's profile is comparable to Jamar Chase's excellence with that 1 year of data. But in terms of his overall numbers, JSN compares better to someone like Amon-Ra St. Brown. Is a fairly decent comparison once you take in some of the film evaluation from like Zachary and the Dynasty Dummies and excuse a little bit of his lower ADOT and high slot rate, because I usually bucket around the 10 ADOT. Amon-Ra St. Brown's ADOT was slightly over 10, JSN's is slightly over 9, but their slot rates are fairly comparable as well, with the average slot rate of Amon-Ra St. Brown being about 70% and JSN's being in this one sample, in this 1 year, 88%. A more comfortable comparison because of that 1 year sample size, and I have to squint to see Amon-Ra St. Brown, is probably actually Cooper Kupp, but he was playing at a lot lower level, so that makes for an uncomfortable comparison as well. But that's the type of role he's playing at and excelling in college. And he was running 4 yards per route run. 4. Even in a single season, that's a fairly high number. That's double the average of most players who hit in the NFL, whatever position they're playing at, and specifically in the slot with a lower ADOT, you would expect a lower yards per route run. It's Jedi-like. He's also getting that 3.3 receiving yards per team pass attempt, which I think is a better overall number to measure how much of the offensive team actually relies on for that player. And again, the average is around 2, and JSN in that single season with both Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson on the team is over 3. There are really no notes here. If you don't think there's an elite wide receiver prospect in this year's class, I would encourage you to look a little harder at JSN. He's not Jamar Chase, but that's the level of profile in terms of how likely it is or how comparable it is to those who go on to succeed. My wide receiver 2 in this class is Jordan Addison, and I like it more the more I look at it. There's actually some really interesting versatility to the way he was used in college, which I think is an overall positive, and actually puts him in a slightly odd bucket in terms of the way I'm looking at slot rate and ADP as well. So let's talk about that a little more. Jordan Addison played 3 years from age 18 to 20, never played less than 11 games, so we have no notes like we do with JSN. In fact, his overall profile is just green ticks across the board. I have very few notes. He just did exactly what you would expect a great prospect for the NFL to do in every situation. Never less than 23% of the team's overall receiving yards, and that was in his last year when he only played 11 games, opposed to the 14 games he played in year 2 at age 19, when he was 38% of the team's overall receiving yards and 26% of the team's touchdowns. So usually touchdowns can be somewhat of a red flag if you're overly dependent on them, but he was heavily involved in the receiving game in terms of yards as well. So yeah, just no notes. He looks exceptional. Digging into the profile a little more, you see that his slot rate actually adjusted over time. Early in the first 2 years, he was playing over 80%, then over 60%. In the last year, when he transferred or was traded, I don't know how it works in college, to USC in that final year, that lower slot rate or whatever he was doing in that final year seemed to convince them to use him even lower in the slots, who is more out wide. Now that versatility, while it does create a bit of a problem with the way I was trying to bucket players, that's just a me problem. I should get over it, and I have, because he was exceptional at a low slot rate as well. With only 23% slot rate, he was still earning 25% targets per route run, which again is an exceptional rate at which to earn targets. And he's over 25% of the team's overall targets in a higher conference. He elevated and excelled in an entirely different role. That's very impressive. Digging into his usage a little bit more, you see his ADOT also rise through the first 2 years. As his slot rate begins to decrease in year 2, he only has a 9 up to a 12 ADOT in that second year at the lower conference. And then when he transfers into USC at a higher conference, presumably a higher competition level with a lower slot rate, he actually moves closer to the line of scrimmage with only a 10 ADOT, but he still manages to perform well above average with a 2.7 yards per route run, and hits his height in year 2 at age 19 with a 2.9, with that decent but not exponential top 5% slot rate used in the NFL. Now, the reason the slot rate is important is not just his overall usage and to see that versatility, it's because the slot is being used increasingly in the NFL as a main function of where the engine of your offense and the receiving game functions. And so the fact that Jordan Addison has shown versatility both wide and slot is actually really important. I think it probably makes him more interesting to NFL teams, which we'll see in the draft. The reason he falls behind JSN for me a little bit is just because that 1 year of JSN is so exceptional. He was more of the team's offense with more draft capital, known studs in the NFL on the roster, and that just quietens some noise for me. His highest receiving yards per team pass attempt is 2.9, which is actually in a regular year phenomenal. Again, the first 2 players I have ranked in this year's class would be the wide receiver 1. Actually, they would just be the wide receiver 1 in most draft classes, except for Ja'Marr Chase's draft class. Speaking of which, just before I carry on, I want to mention that Zach Reed keeps referring to 2018. And I don't mean to keep bringing up Zach, but he's someone I pay attention to a lot when it comes to profiling, and especially when it comes to understanding what players are doing on the field, because he's pretty good at it, and he uses tape, which I don't, and so it gives me an insight into players I wouldn't otherwise have. 2018 is a little bit of a rough year for me. I'm still not entirely happy with the modeling I've got running right now, which is why I haven't just splurged all of that into the database, and so I'm still playing with it a little bit. But within my sample size from 2016 to 2023 now, using PFS stats, the year that keeps coming up for me is 2021. I'm not just using Ja'Marr Chase for, bait. It's actually the year that keeps coming up for me. Again, 2 prospects in this class fit in the Ja'Marr Chase tier in terms of how good their profiles are in the roles in which they were playing in college, which were different than what Ja'Marr Chase was doing. That makes it complicated, but that's where the tier starts. Both of them are far better prospects than Elijah Moore. It's as if 2023 starts with Ja'Marr Chase and Amon-Ra St. Brown, and people are complaining it's not a very good draft class. I don't understand it. The third wide receiver I have ranked in this year's class operates in a second tier. I have a very strong second tier. Again, talking about the thinness of this class, I love my second tier of wide receivers in this year's class. They're probably going to be drafted towards the end of the first round, and I like all of them quite a lot. Going to put that up front. But the guy I have at the top of the tier, and right now my tiers are more important than my ranks, but I do have Keyshawn Booty as wide receiver 3 overall. The more I think about it, the more I like the vagueness of Keyshawn Boutte's profile in this tier because there's more upside in that unknown than in the two other prospects I have in this tier who I think were more productive and proved themselves to be more productive in their roles. Let me explain that a little bit. Keyshawn Boutte's role is a little uncertain because he didn't play for 3 full years, because in his final year he suffered for an ankle injury. I think he actually had double ankle surgery in this offseason. So there's a lot of vagueness and also uncertainty in his profile because we don't know really what's going to happen with his health or what the NFL is going to think of him overall. But in terms of how productive he was on the field, I was a little disappointed to start with. I expected, after profiling him a little bit last year when I was looking at Terrace Marshall, to see him expand in 2022 and become a top tier prospect. He didn't because of those injuries, I'm pretty sure. If we look at what he was actually doing with Terrace Marshall, and it's a high draft capital team. These are high drafted wide receivers most of the time. Terrace Marshall, again, I've already thrown out. So there's a target competition going on that team most years anyway. But he was used 7% in the slot in his first year, barely 47% in his second year. So he's a lower slot player than both JSN and Addison for most of the years in which Addison played. That's interesting because there's very few low slot players in this year's draft class who I think have a high degree of likelihood of being good in the NFL. And because we didn't see Keyshon's career play out in fully, we don't really know where he would have fit in on average without that last year. Now, if you look at that last year, you see his grades drop off the board entirely for the most part. You actually see that he drops to 18% of the team's overall receiving yards, and that's on a per game basis, so that's not just because of the time he missed, and only 11% of the touchdowns, whereas the year before, he was 33% of the team's overall receiving yards, and 60% of the team's is earning a target, and 24% of his routes run after Terrace Marshall left for the NFL, which is what you would expect for an incoming player at age 19, fully showing out what he can do. As a comparison, the reason a lot of people liked Terrace Marshall last year was because he put up similar numbers at age 21 to what Boutte was putting up at age 19. That's pretty interesting, and it's unfortunate in this last year he drops to such a low percentage of the team's receiving yards because of those injuries. You can see that he only played, 11 games that final season and 6 games that first season, in that second season, and that's tricky. But that first and second year, a better trajectory than Marshall was having, even if we squint at that second season with a 6-game sample size in general, and was a better trajectory than Marshall was having at an earlier age. And that's enticing, especially for a lower slot player through those first 2 years at a higher draft. So the next player, the fourth player I have in this year's wide receiver ranks as part of that second tier is actually Quentin Johnson, which is... yeah, he should be here, if not above Boutte, and the draft is probably going to tell us more of what's probably going to happen with that guy, so right now I'm fairly happy to have Kayshon above him, but Quentin Johnson's a much more rounded profile with a lot fewer questions. Again, I just like the mystery of that upside in the potential of what we didn't see from Kayshon last year. Quentin Johnson's a really good prospect. Again, I don't do a lot of comps, but his comps range somewhere between Mike Williams and, I don't know, Kenny Golladay up to DK Metcalf, and I think he rests closer to Kenny Golladay than he does DK Metcalf. That's not meant to be shade. I fought hard for Kenny Golladay in his draft year because not a lot of people liked him, and I thought he was a really good prospect. So it's meant to be a positive comparison, but whenever you're going for the lower end of that range, people tend to hate it, so I just want to throw that out there. He was never less than 20% of the team's overall receiving yards. He never got less than 2 yards per route run in a less impressive fashion than Jordan Addison, especially because he was working at a lower slot rate for most of that season. He never got above a 15% slot rate, so you have a higher expectation in yards per route run, which is why I think Jordan Addison is a different tier of prospect. But if he was a top wide receiver in this year's class, I'd be fine with it. But we have prospects that I think have a lot more upside in it. Essentially, my problem with Quentin Johnson is because of the role he was playing, you have higher expectation for his yards per route run number and his receiving yards per team pass attempt, and he hit the minimum. It is worth noting he only played 8 games through those first 2 seasons. In his final season, when he plays more than 10 games, that's when he balloons up to 3 yards per route run and 2.9 receiving yards per team pass attempt, which again are both excellent numbers. Again, it's hard not to like a guy who's 30% of his team's overall yards every year. My wide receiver 5 in this year's draft class right now, pre-draft, before the combine and everything else, having dug into their profiles pretty well, at least in the top 5, fairly actively, is Josh Downs. I prefer his profile than everyone but my top 2 wide receivers in this draft class. The reason he's ranking at the bottom of my second tier as wide receiver 5 is because of likely expectation for fantasy in the NFL. He might be one of the most prolific producers in his role that's in this draft class, but his role is definitely set, and there's a lack of versatility. He didn't move around as much as some of the other wide receivers we've already talked about in this draft class, and so that's probably his role going into the NFL. He's got an ADOT below 9 most years and a slot rate that's exceptionally high. He was 9% of the team's receiving yards his first year, 40% year 2, 30% year 1. Again, those are actually great numbers playing from age 18 to 19. He was heavily involved in the touchdown column as well, which again is not a concern if you're also involved in yards. It's not like your production numbers are being boosted too much by them. And an epic amount of targets relative to the team pass against, and again, these are all per game. But his slot usage was consistently over 80%, which is like, again, a top 5 percentile usage. Very few wide receivers are getting used at an 80% plus slot rate, let alone consistently over your first 3 years. And his ADOT, despite being over 13 in his first year, was below 9 his second 2 years when he was playing the most. So I'm pretty sure that's what the NFL is going to see and how the NFL is going to want to use him no matter where he gets drafted. But I do expect at least second round draft capital for Josh Downs because there's very few wide receivers. In fact, I would say there's no wide receivers as productive with as many years on his profile to show that he's this productive at this particular role. I think he deserves round 2 draft capital, but we'll have to see how it goes. Comps, again, suck, but just to put it in perspective, I think he's a high-end Greg Dortch with more draft capital. Now, you could make some comparisons to Rondale Moore, but Rondale Moore was used more dynamically, but he does have that low ADOT high slot usage that you see on Downs' profile, just not as consistent because Rondale Moore really just played 1 year, and he was a known athletic freak who just, they got him the ball as quickly as possible and let him do things at age 18. And Downs seems to be very much a skilled and talented I guess route runner, being used heavily in the slot because that's what good slot wide receivers have to do, and be proficient in route running. Yes, I looked up tape information. Alright, those are my top 5 wide receivers in this year's class. I'm actually really comfortable with their profiles at this point. I really like this class. Again, if I was going to make a comparison, since 2018 is probably a better comparison because Zach's very good at what he does, but 2021 keeps coming back to me in that they play in drastically different roles. And since we're not actual GMs of NFL teams and I don't have roles that I need to fill, I just want the fantasy points, give me 2023, man. I think it's a really good class. I think we should be excited about this class. And I think anyone who isn't excited about this class, let me know what you think. Thanks very much, and I'll see you in the next.